My name is Miranda, and for the past 2 years I've watched my husband Mark slowly fade away since he was first diagnosed with stomach cancer. I remember how on the day when the doctor told us this news, the air in the office suddenly became viscous, heavy, so that it was impossible to breathe, and the ground under my feet seemed to turn into quicksand, taking me into some new, terrible reality where the word future ceased to matter. Mark was only 38, he was a strong, full of strength man. He succeeded in his investment banking career, made plans, dreamed, lived the way people live, confident in the future. We had a 9-year-old son, Ethan, an intelligent, inquisitive boy who adored his father and couldn't imagine a world without him. At that moment, I couldn't either. We were supposed to grow old together, see our son grow up, fall in love, get married, and have children of his own. We had to share more than 1 decade filled with joy, travel, laughter, and not count the remaining months, weeks, and days. The only silver lining in this nightmare was that Mark's financial success allowed us to receive the best treatment we could find. We flew to leading experts all over the country, tried new, experimental methods, spent everything we could, but the further time went, the clearer it became, these efforts will not save him, they only delay the inevitable. I remember how at first I clung to every hope, every opportunity, even the most illusory, but the disease took Mark inexorably, methodically, destroying his body and sucking the life out of him. Mark's parents, Linda and Robert, became our mainstay during this time. They lived only 20 minutes away and were always ready to help, lend a shoulder, pick Ethan up from school on those days when Mark was prescribed heavy procedures. "Miranda, don't worry about dinner," Linda said. "I've made lasagna, just warm it up for you." She did everything to make my life easier, to support me in some way, and for that I was grateful to her. Ethan often tugged at my sleeve before going to bed, looked into my eyes with that naive, agonizing hope that made my heart ache. "Mom, when will Dad get better?" he asked, and I didn't know what to answer, because telling a 9-year-old child that his father was dying was beyond my strength. I was just stroking his head, whispering to him, "The doctors are doing their best, honey," and I hoped that there was at least some truth in this consolation. My own parents, Karen and David, lived as close as Mark's parents, but they could have been on another planet. They were so far away from everything that was happening. "Mom, can you pick Ethan up from school today? Mark has a bad reaction to chemotherapy, and Linda has a doctor's appointment." "Oh, Miranda, I'm so sorry, but we promised to help your sister find an apartment. You know how stressed Jessica is." My whole life has revolved around Jessica. When I was 7, my parents missed my school play because of her cold. When I graduated from high school, they left right after the ceremony to catch her dance concert, even though she wasn't even performing solo. I've gotten used to it over the years. Mark became my real family, his parents took care of me more than my own. And when his condition deteriorated dramatically in the last month, I prepared for the inevitable, surrounded by the family that chose me. The night Mark left, I held his hand. His breathing became less frequent, weaker. The hospice nurse said it wouldn't be for long. "Miranda," he whispered, his voice almost indistinguishable. "Take care of Ethan. You are the strongest." These were his last words. I sat with him for a few more hours after he froze. I just held his cooling hand, unable to realize that my husband, my partner, my love was gone. Linda and Robert arrived at the hospital less than an hour after my call, and when they entered the room, I saw in their eyes the same grief that tore me apart from the inside, the same disbelief that this man, their son, my husband, Ethan's father, whom we all loved, no longer he's breathing, he won't open his eyes, he won't smile, he won't say a word. Linda came up to me first, her face pale, her lips trembling, but her voice carried the familiar maternal tenderness with which she had treated me all these years. "We're here, honey," she said, wrapping me in a warm embrace that only now made me realize how cold I was, even though the room was stuffy, too stuffy, as if the walls were shrinking, leaving no room for air. "We'll always be here," she repeated, And I knew it was true. I knew they wouldn't turn away, wouldn't leave me alone with this nightmare, with the emptiness that was already beginning to grow inside. The same night, when I returned home, I wrote a short message to my mother. Mark died last night. Her reply came an hour later, in just 2 words. It's terrible. Not a call, not an offer to come, not a single question about how I am, how Ethan is, not a hint of sympathy or a desire to support. But I was too numb to be angry or upset, too exhausted to react emotionally in any way. It was necessary to organize a funeral. It was necessary to explain to Ethan that his father would not come home, that now he would only see him in photographs, hear his voice only in memories. The next few days flew by in a kind of haze. Phone calls, paperwork, choosing a coffin, coordinating details with a funeral home, searching for a suit for Ethan, all this mixed into one continuous endless movement, where I mechanically performed tasks, but at the same time I felt like an observer of my own life, as if it wasn't happening with me. Linda and Robert were there for me at every stage, answering the phone when I couldn't get a word out, comforting Ethan when he had questions that I couldn't find answers to. The day before the funeral, I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by condolence cards, and realized that I needed at least a few hours to finalize all the details. I need to ask my parents to look after Ethan, I told Linda, clutching my phone. You're already doing so much. She looked at me sadly, but did not object, realizing that it was important for me to at least try to establish a relationship with my parents, even if the experience of the past years screamed at me that there was nothing to hope for. I drove Ethan to his parents' house, rehearsing on the way what I would say, how I would ask them to help, but when the door opened and I saw my mother, ready to leave, with a purse in her hands and in a light raincoat, I realized that my voice might not sound firm enough. Miranda, this is not a good time, she said, without even inviting us in. We're just leaving. Mom, please, I felt my patience, already exhausted, straining like a string. It's only for a few hours. I need to finalize everything with the funeral. We planned it in advance. My father appeared in the doorway, standing behind my mother with the same detached expression on his face. We can't cancel them now, he said, as if the conversation was already over, as if no amount of reasoning could change it. I could argue, I could beg, I could remind them that their son-in-law is dead, that their grandson needs support now, that I, their daughter, need help. But they just left, locking the door behind them, and the mother, without turning around, said, "We really have to go. I'm sure you'll find someone else." They hurried to the car without even saying goodbye to Ethan, who was standing next to me in complete confusion. His small fingers squeezed my palm, and I felt a wave of resentment and fatigue wash over me, so deep that it was hard to breathe. I called Sarah, and she, of course, immediately agreed to look after him, without hesitation, without unnecessary excuses. After dropping Ethan off at her house, I inexplicably drove around the block and found myself back at my parents' house. Lights were on in the windows, and Jessica's familiar red Mazda was parked in the driveway. I closed my eyes and exhaled, but instead of tears, a bitter, dry laugh appeared on my lips. They weren't busy. They didn't have any important plans. They just chose to spend the evening with Jessica rather than help me. Even now. That evening, I opened a family chat on WhatsApp and wrote, "Mark's funeral will take place at 11 a.m. on Thursday at Greenwood Chapel. There will be a small reception after the ceremony." I saw gray check marks appear next to the names of my parents and Jessica, which changed to blue after a few seconds. They read it. No one answered. The night before, when all the business was settled, when the last call to the funeral home was made and the last list was rechecked, the anxiety that had been nagging at me since the day Mark left suddenly surged with renewed force, and I, unable to cope with this feeling, dialed my mother's number. "Mom, you saw my message about the funeral tomorrow, right? They start at 11. There was a tense pause on the line, and for a second it seemed to me that she was deliberately taking the time to think about what to say. "Oh, Miranda, I'm sorry, but we won't be able to come." Her voice finally came, flat and cold, as if it wasn't about saying goodbye to a man who had been part of our family for more than a decade, but about some minor meeting that could easily be missed. "Jessica has booked a few tables at Emilio's. We're going to celebrate her promotion. It's noon now, and we've already agreed." I almost dropped the phone, not immediately realizing what she had just said. "Mom," I said slowly, almost syllabically, feeling a wave of rage rising inside. "It's Mark's funeral. We're talking about the person who paid you 3 years ago to repair the roof when it collapsed. About Mark, who was there for me when I didn't have anyone." "It was a long time ago, Miranda," she interrupted without a trace of emotion in her voice. "We need to focus on the living, not the dead. Jessica needs our support right now." I opened my mouth to say something, but I heard a short beep when the call ended. She just hung up. My hands were shaking with anger and disbelief when I immediately dialed my sister's number. "Hey," she said irritably, not even trying to hide that my call was bothering her. "Jessica, Mom said you're having a party tomorrow at the same time as Mark's funeral. Can't you at least move the time a little so they can come to the service?" "Oh, no way," she grinned, and even through the phone I could feel the smugness with which she said it. "I can't change the booking, everything has already been confirmed." "It's not like I can bear a funeral or anything like that." My voice trembled, but not from fear or weakness, but from anger, from the pain that tore me from the inside out. "Funeral," she mimicked, as if it were something insignificant. "Miranda, my husband is dead. Mark paid for your college tuition." "That was a long time ago," she interrupted me. "Look, my promotion is more important than the funeral. People are dying every day." And again the short beeps. I stood in the kitchen, still clutching my phone, not believing that this had really happened. As if it wasn't enough that they chose Jessica instead of me, they also needed to plunge this knife deeper, twist it to make sure that I feel it as strongly as possible. The phone lit up with a new message. "Mom, stop putting pressure on your sister. Her holiday is more important than the funeral. She worked hard for this promotion." I didn't answer. I just deleted the message. The day of Mark's funeral was one of those clear, sunny days that seemed like a mockery of what was going on inside me. It was as if the world continued to live its life, not paying attention to the fact that mine was crumbling. The service was simple but touching, exactly what Mark would have wanted. He never liked pretentious ceremonies. He was never a man who would like to have pompous farewells after his departure. The chapel was filled with people who really cared about him: colleagues, friends, neighbors, his parents, his real family. I came forward to deliver the eulogy, and although it seemed to me that I no longer had tears, my voice was trembling. I talked about his generosity, his kindness, and how he always put Ethan first. My son was sitting between Linda and Robert, who held his hands, comforting him when he couldn't hold back his sobs. I could see his small shoulders shaking, and I wanted to go over, hug him, tell him everything was going to be okay. But I couldn't. Because that would be a lie. After the service, people came up to me, expressed their condolences, told stories about Mark, and shared their memories. I was surprised I didn't see your parents. One of his old friends, with whom he shared a room in college, told me. "Are they sick?" I took a deep breath, suppressing the lump in my throat. "They had other obligations," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. Linda, noticing how unpleasant this conversation was to me, smoothly turned the topic to something else, for which I was grateful to her. That evening, after everyone had left, when the last cars left the driveway, and the house was quiet again, I sat in the living room surrounded by flowers and condolence cards, and for the first time all day I allowed myself to feel how empty this house had become. The silence was so deafening that it felt like she was screaming. My phone vibrated, flashing a message from Jessica. "I hope the funeral went well. Mom posted photos from my party. I've been promoted to senior account manager. No condolences. No recognition of what I've just been through. There is not the slightest hint of sympathy or awareness that I have buried my husband, that my son has been left without a father, that there is now a yawning void in my life that nothing can fill. Just celebrating her achievement, holiday emojis, and as if nothing had happened between us, as if they hadn't ignored Mark's funeral for dinner at a restaurant. I exhaled, feeling disgust and fatigue spread through my body in a heavy, sticky wave. I turned off my phone without even bothering to reply, and went upstairs to check on Ethan. He was curled up in a ball, fast asleep, his tiny fingers clutching the teddy bear Mark had given him for his last birthday. I lay down next to him, softly covering him up warmly, finding in this some kind of solace, some kind of warmth that I was missing so much right now. For the next week, I moved through life in a daze, as if I were between sleep and reality, unable to fully realize that Mark was no more. Linda and Robert came every day, brought food, took Ethan to the park, and helped me sort Mark's things, even though I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I couldn't bring myself to throw away even his old coffee cup, let alone something more. My parents haven't called once. They didn't ask how I was doing, they didn't ask how Ethan was holding up, they didn't even try to look concerned. I didn't hold a grudge, I just didn't care about them anymore. It was a week after the funeral when Mark's lawyer, Mr. Simmons, called me. Mrs. Turner, his voice was soft but businesslike. It's time to discuss Mark's will. He was very thorough in his preparations. We have scheduled the reading for 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any less painful. Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I will. After the call, I dialed Linda and Robert, inviting them to be present. Of course, they were already listed in the will, but even if they weren't, I knew Mark would want them around. The next day, at exactly 2 p.m., Mr. Simmons arrived at our house. He was dressed in a severe gray suit, holding a leather briefcase in his hands, and his face was serious, but when he saw Ethan, he softened a little. Your father often talked about you, he said, formally shaking Ethan's small hand. He was very proud of you. Ethan nodded, wiping his nose with the palm of his hand. We all sat in the living room, me, Ethan, Linda, and Robert. I didn't expect any surprises. Mark and I discussed his wishes when the disease began to progress. I knew he wanted to leave everything to me and Ethan, help his parents, maybe make a couple of donations to the foundations he supported. I was ready for this, ready to hear the words that would put another end to his life, to our past. But before Mr. Simmons could begin, the doorbell rang. Linda looked at me questioningly. Are you expecting someone? No, I replied, feeling a little uneasy. I went to the door, and when I opened it, it took me a few seconds to realize who was standing in front of me. My parents. And Jessica. They stood on the porch as if they really cared what was going on behind those walls. As if they had a right to be here, after all. What are you doing here? My voice was strained, icy, but rage was boiling inside me. We've heard about the reading of the will, the mother said, peeking into the house as if she couldn't wait to slip inside. Mark was part of our family, you know we have a right to be here. Right? I laughed, but it came out bitter and empty. You couldn't come to his funeral, but do you have the right to be here? The father cleared his throat, taking a step forward. Miranda, there's no need to bring up old grudges. We're here to support you. I looked at him, feeling something break inside. Support me? I shook my head. That's nice. I wanted to close the door, but my mother, without asking permission, gently but firmly pushed her way inside, followed by my father and Jessica. We're a family, she said, as if that one word could justify their betrayal. I stood in the hallway, amazed by their audacity, their hypocrisy, their ability to twist reality in a way that suits them. They were never my family. Family is about people who are there for you when you're at your worst. This is Linda, this is Robert, this is Ethan. but not them. And now they were standing in my living room, with an expression of exaggerated sympathy on their faces, acting as if nothing had happened. When they unceremoniously headed into the living room, as if they felt like they owned it, Linda and Robert's faces darkened noticeably when they saw who had arrived. "What are they doing here?" Robert whispered, leaning towards me when I returned and clenched my fingers into fists, trying to suppress the rising indignation. "I have no idea," I replied dryly, watching as my parents and Jessica, with the air of people who do not consider their appearance anything out of the ordinary, sit down on the sofa opposite Linda and Robert. I could feel my hands shaking, but I was never going to make a scene in front of Ethan. He might still be too young to fully understand all the subtleties of the adult world, but his penetrating gaze was already noticing too much, and I didn't want to add new conflicts to his life. Mr. Simmons, a professional to the core, just raised an eyebrow slightly, looking from me to the new guests, but said nothing. "Let's continue reading the will," he said calmly, opening a leather folder. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Jessica and my parents were sitting across from Linda and Robert, and Ethan was sitting next to me in a chair, tucking his legs under him and clutching a teddy bear. I, Mark Andrew Turner, being in my right mind, declare that this is my last will. Mr. Simmons's voice sounded flat and emotionless, but every word hurt me. Mark left his parents $200,000, enough to provide them with a comfortable old age and express his gratitude for their continued support throughout our life together and especially during his illness. Linda sobbed softly, and Robert tightened his grip on her hand, as if he himself was shocked by how much their son took care of them until the last moment. Then the lawyer moved on to the main points. Mark left me our house, 2 apartments in the city center that I didn't even know he owned, and $400,000 in liquid assets. "Apartments generate significant rental income," Mr. Simmons explained, glancing at me over the top of his glasses. "Mark bought them as an investment 3 years ago." I sat there, stunned, trying to comprehend the extent of his foresight. Mark planned everything so that Ethan and I would be provided for, no matter what. He thought about the future, even when he knew that he himself would not have that future. But I noticed how my mother's expression changed at that moment. The slight sympathy she was trying to portray was replaced by undisguised interest, and her gaze became appraising. Jessica, who had seemed indifferent before, suddenly straightened up, as if what had been said had finally caught her attention. When Mr. Simmons finished, there was silence. My mother spoke first, clapping her hands as if she had just heard the good news. "Well, that's wonderful news, isn't it, Miranda? You're pretty well off now." An even heavier silence hung in the room. Linda and Robert stared at her in obvious shock, but she didn't seem to notice their reactions. "I mean," she continued, ignoring the tension in the air, "with 2 apartments and all that money, you can certainly help the family." "Yes, Miranda," Jessica immediately chimed in, blushing with excitement for some reason. "You know that I have been struggling with financial difficulties for so long. Isn't that right, dear?" My mother echoed, clearly expecting me to start nodding and agreeing with them. Jessica nodded fervently, pursing her lips. "It's so expensive these days," she continued in a fake sad voice. "And you have 2 apartments just standing there." I blinked in disbelief. Mark has not yet cooled down in his grave, and they are already looking at his assets. "You should give one of these apartments to Jessica," my father intervened, looking as if he had just offered me a perfectly reasonable and logical thing. "What do you need to?" I stood up slowly, feeling my fingers clench into fists, and the anger that I had been trying so hard to keep under control was about to burst out. "Are you serious now?" My voice was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. "You're skipping Mark's funeral for a party, ignoring Ethan and me for a week, and then showing up uninvited to the reading of the will to claim his estate?" "Miranda," my father began in his condescending tone, which I've heard all my life, "there's no need to be selfish. Now you're alone, but you have all this wealth. You have to share it. Selfish? I repeated it, my voice rising with each word. I'm not alone. I have Ethan. I took a step forward, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. And all that Mark left is for his son's future. Every penny will go to ensure that Ethan gets a better education, better opportunities, and a better life, which his father can no longer provide for him. I looked at them, seeing how their faces slowly stretched out from the realization that their plans were crumbling right in front of them. I watched as my parents and Jessica exchanged glances, and what flashed in their gazes made me go cold. Not anger, not disappointment, not embarrassment at exposing their selfish intentions, but something like resentment, as if I was depriving them of something that rightfully belonged to them. As if I was the one doing them an injustice, and not the other way around. You're being ridiculous, my mother said sharply, jerking her head up, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Jessica needs help now, not some kid who won't even go to college for years. A child? Robert's voice was strained with anger, his fingers clenched tightly on the armrest of his chair. Are you calling him some kind of kid? This is your grandson. And his father. He paused, trying to control himself, but there was righteous anger in his eyes. His father just died. My mother's face turned purple. Don't you dare tell me how to treat my own grandson. She blurted out, turning to Robert with a fury that seemed completely ridiculous to me in the current situation. Linda looked at her coldly, narrowing her eyes. We've been in this family longer than you have, she said in a flat, icy voice. Nevertheless, it's amazing how little interest you've shown in being a part of it. That's enough, I said firmly, feeling that my patience had finally run out. I turned to Ethan, who was sitting on the edge of an armchair, clutching his teddy bear, and despite his silence, I knew that he felt the tension in the room as keenly as the rest of us. Ethan, can you go upstairs to your room for a while? I asked softly, trying to keep my voice calm. Take Mr. Simmons with you, show him your model airplanes. The lawyer, clearly relieved to be able to step away from the family drama, immediately stood up and extended his hand to Ethan. I would love to see your collection, young man, he said with a slight smile. Ethan nodded, got up, and walked with Mr. Simmons up the stairs without looking back. As soon as they were gone, I turned to my parents and Jessica, no longer holding back. How dare you come to my house a few days after my husband's funeral, which you didn't even bother to attend, and demand his money? My voice was flat, but there was steel in it. Mark has worked his whole life to provide for me and Ethan. He has been fighting cancer for 2 years, and in all that time, what kind of help have you offered? Nothing. You couldn't even look after Ethan for a few hours. It's not fair, my father began, but I cut him off by stepping closer. Unfair? There was a bitter laugh in my voice. It's unfair that Mark spent thousands of dollars to repair your roof when it collapsed during a storm 3 years ago. It's unfair that he paid for Jessica's studies because you said you couldn't afford it. I shifted my gaze to my sister, who was sulking with her arms crossed over her chest. Let me make one thing clear. I won't give you a dime. Not now, not ever. Every part of Mark's estate will be used solely to support Ethan and ensure his future. That's what my husband wanted, and that's what's going to happen. My mother's face was contorted with anger, her cheeks were burning, and her lips were pressed even tighter. You're ungrateful. She spat out, clenching her fists. After all we've done for you. I raised my eyebrows, crossing my arms over my chest. What exactly did you do for me, Mom? I asked coldly. Name one thing. She opened her mouth and immediately closed it, blinking as if trying to come up with something. I shook my head. That's the answer, I said softly, feeling something inside finally snap. I think it's time for you to leave. She tried to speak, but I had already opened the door, not giving her a chance to continue. My parents and Jessica stood up in silence, their faces contorted with indignation, but I no longer felt any fear or regret. Just emptiness. When the door slammed behind them, I collapsed onto the couch, suddenly feeling how exhausted I was. Robert came over and gently put his hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said firmly but warmly. I swallowed, clenching my hands into fists. They're still my parents. And Jessica is still my sister. Linda sat down next to me and took my hand. "Biology doesn't create a family," she said softly. "Love creates a family. Presence creates a family. Being around in difficult times creates a family." I nodded, knowing she was right, but my chest still ached from the rejection that had plagued me all my life. Now it was final. Later that evening, when Linda and Robert went home, and Ethan fell asleep, his breathing became even, soothing, as if the world around him had not collapsed, as if everything was still as before. I finally allowed myself to sink into a chair in front of the computer, hoping to disconnect at least for a while from everything that had happened that day. But as soon as I opened social media, I saw a notification. My mother had tagged me in her post. Heartbroken that my eldest daughter became so greedy and selfish after her husband's death, refusing to help her struggling sister, even though she now has 2 apartments in the city center and a lot of money. Material well-being has changed her. I stared at the screen, almost unable to believe my eyes, and with every passing moment, as I reread these words over and over again, anger boiled up inside me unlike anything I had ever felt before. In the comments under the post, support was already flaring up from relatives and friends who only knew the distorted version of events that their mother had presented to them. "Don't let Miranda go. The family has to help the family. Poor Jessica, who is always fighting, while Miranda gets everything for her. How can you be so callous to your own sister?" I clenched my fingers into fists, feeling rage and resentment coursing through my veins, turning into icy determination. Even for my mother, it was a new bottom to try to publicly shame me into submission, to make me look greedy and heartless in the eyes of those who didn't even know the whole truth. She wasn't just manipulating me behind closed doors, as she had done all my life. Now she was taking our family filth out into the public, confident that her version would remain the only one heard. I took a deep breath, put my hands on the keyboard, and started typing. I've been silent about this for a long time, but since my mother decided to make our family affairs public, I feel I have to respond. 3 days ago, we buried my husband Mark after his 2-year battle with stomach cancer. My parents and sister did not attend his funeral. Why? Because my sister planned a party in honor of her promotion on the same day, and they thought it was more important. My fingers moved quickly, the rage and pain pent up for years poured into words, finally finding a way out. For those who don't know, Mark has helped my parents financially many times over the years. He paid for major repairs to their house after the storm destroyed the roof. He paid for my sister's college tuition in full because my parents claimed they couldn't afford it. Despite all this, when I needed help during his illness, even just to look after our son for a few hours, they were always too busy. I paused, rereading what I had written before continuing. Yesterday, they showed up uninvited to read Mark's will. When they found out that he had left me and our son financially secure, they immediately demanded that I give one of the rented apartments to Jessica. Their argument? I quote, "She needs it more than any child." Which one is some kid? Their 9-year-old grandson, who had just lost his father. The angry flame inside me had not subsided, but now it burned steadily, not blinding, but giving a crystal clear understanding. I wasn't going to stand by their behavior anymore. I'm not sharing this to humiliate or shame anyone. I'm sharing this because I'm tired of being portrayed as the villain in a story where I was just trying to be a good daughter, a good sister, a good wife and mother. Mark's money will be used for his son's education and future, as he intended. I hope this clears up the situation. I added screenshots, a message from my mother, where she wrote that Jessica's party was more important than Mark's funeral, correspondence in which they refused to help during his illness, comments where they directly told me that I should share the inheritance. My finger hovered over the publish button, and for a moment the thought crept in, is this necessary? Maybe it's better to just ignore it. But I knew that if I didn't say anything, they would continue to spin the story in their favor. I clicked publish. The comments under my mother's original post changed the tone faster than I expected. Karen, is it true that you missed your son-in-law's funeral for the sake of the party? I can't believe you expected Miranda to give away the property intended for her son. These messages are shocking. How can you say that a party is more important than a funeral? The wave of indignation that now descended on my mother and Jessica was swift and relentless, and for the first time in their lives they could not control the situation, could not change the course of events in their favor. I watched as their supporters started asking questions one by one, as their support evaporated, leaving only silence in its wake. I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. It didn't take away my pain. It didn't erase everything they had done. But at least for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Calls and messages came throughout the evening. Relatives and friends expressed shock at my parents' behavior. Someone cautiously offered support. Someone condemned them in the comments. Someone simply asked if it was true. My mother tried to defend herself, claiming that I had misinterpreted everything, that the screenshots were a misunderstanding taken out of context, that in fact they just wanted to help, and I had misinterpreted everything. But words are one thing, and evidence is quite another. The screenshots spoke for themselves. Soon, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, she deleted her post. But it was too late. People who had considered our family a model of integrity all their lives saw the truth, and nothing could erase what they read from their memory. The damage to her reputation had been done, and now, no matter what voice she used to justify herself, most were no longer listening. The next morning, I woke up to the vibration of my phone, dozens of unanswered calls, voice messages, notifications of new emails. My parents and Jessica tried to contact me, as if they needed me again now that public opinion had turned against them. I didn't listen to their messages. I didn't want to know what they would say, how they would justify themselves, with what words they would try to pressure pity. Instead, I just blocked their numbers. But they didn't give up. Over the next few weeks, they tried to reach me in every possible way. They sent emails begging for forgiveness, but requests for money still slipped between the lines. They sent messages through mutual friends, hinting that the family should be together. They even showed up at my house, expecting me to let them in. As if nothing had happened. Every time, I stood firm on my decision. They'll never change, will they? I asked Linda one afternoon as we sat in the backyard and watched Ethan play with a ball, laughing carefree. She looked at me warmly, but there was an unfailing honesty in her eyes. People rarely change unless they see a need for it. I crossed my arms thoughtfully over my chest. I always thought that I needed their approval, their love. I've spent my whole life trying to earn it. But now you realize your own worth, Linda finished for me, squeezing my hand. And you can see that Ethan deserves more than a repeat of this cycle. 6 months later, life returned to a new normal. Linda and Robert continued to be an integral part of our lives, inviting us to family dinners, helping with Ethan's school activities, driving him to soccer practice, and picnicking in the park on Sundays. I started doing rental real estate, which Mark left us, and, unexpectedly for myself, I found a kind of satisfaction in this. Apartments in the city center turned out to be excellent investments, providing a stable income that allowed me to save money for Ethan's education and not worry about tomorrow. I also invested some of the remaining funds in stocks, the ones Mark always talked about with a twinkle in his eye, believing that they would bring good results in the future. I didn't understand investing as much as he did, but I followed his example and watched with satisfaction as the dividends dripped into my account, as if confirming that he was right. My parents and Jessica no longer tried to contact me directly, but I heard about them from time to time through distant relatives. Apparently, things weren't going well for them. Jessica lost her job, and my parents complained about retirement expenses, as if all their troubles had fallen on them at once. Every time someone hinted that maybe I could help, my response remained the same. I'm sorry to hear that they have problems. But my main responsibility is my son. Some said that I had become cold, that I was acting too harshly. Maybe that's how it was. But when I looked at Ethan, who was getting stronger, more confident, happier every day, surrounded by people who truly loved him, who didn't demand anything in return, who were just there because they wanted to be there, I knew I had made the right choice. One evening, as I was putting Ethan to bed, he suddenly turned to me and, looking straight into my eyes, asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you ever miss Grandma Karen and Grandpa David?" I held my breath, feeling something tighten in my chest. I didn't want to lie, but at the same time, I wasn't going to burden him with my adult problems. I missed the relationship I would like to have with them, I finally said, thinking over every word. But not the ones we actually had. He nodded, as if he understood much more than a child his age should understand. "I'm glad that we have Grandma Linda and Grandpa Robert." I smiled, stroking his hair. "Me too, buddy. Me too." Some people have never understood why I cut my family out of my life. They said that family is sacred, that forgiveness is necessary, that no one is perfect. But they have never experienced constant disappointment, never faced a lifelong pattern of favoritism, or known this painful realization that some people are simply unable to put others first. But I understood. And, more importantly, I broke that cycle. Ethan will grow up knowing his worth. Surrounded by people who showed their love through actions, not just words. People who showed up when it was important. Who did not set conditions for their support. Who did not see it as a means to achieve their goals. A real family,